Stepping out of nowhere, I show up in stallion thunder, and now chances of eluding the glass.
Hello and welcome to this week's episode of the Goodrum Show with me, Chris Goodrum. Okay, as per usual, a big thank you to everybody that watched last week's episode of the show and commented and liked and all that kind of stuff. Yeah, it's always nice to do an episode of the show on rum, but this week we're back to whiskey again, and before we look into exactly what we'll be tasting today, or I'll be tasting today, a couple of announcements, I suppose. Right. Firstly, since obviously the lockdown started at the end of March, we've not been able to do the regular monthly whisky tastings in the shop, obviously, and we've decided that on the 24th of this month, we will be doing a virtual whisky evening. We'll be doing it via Zoom, and as I'm currently furloughed, I'm obviously not allowed to be party to anything that involves generating revenue for the company, so I won't actually be hosting it. My colleague Ian will be hosting it, and a number of you know Ian quite well, obviously from the tasting evenings. I will be there in my capacity as a punter. I will be, I shall be on the other side of the fence to a certain extent. So, obviously we can have a chat, and you can ask me questions, and but I will be obviously unofficially involved, should we say? And so anyway, so we're going to limit the numbers to 12. Customers that have already purchased tickets for tasting evenings that haven't gone ahead will have been and will be offered, obviously, first refusal on those tickets. But if there's any of you guys out there that fancy joining us, the tickets will be the usual price, 35 quid, 6 peated malts of various types. They basically each customer will receive a 5cl sample of each of them. The idea is that you would come to the shop and collect it, but obviously if you don't live in Nottingham, then we will obviously post it to you. I'm going to have to obviously say this will be limited to you guys that are in the UK. Really can't do it sort of internationally, I'm afraid, at this moment in time. It may well be that we do in the future. I don't know. Who knows where this coronavirus business is going to end up leading. So that's the first thing that I wanted to announce. Second thing is on the 1st of July, the UK government is allowing furloughed workers to work part-time and still remain furloughed, and so as far as I'm aware, that's what I will be doing, and because I have things that I need to sell, and one of those things is obviously the Series 10 releases from North Star Spirits, and I know there's a lot of you guys out there that really like what Ian is doing. And we had that little bit of a cock up with Series 9, but obviously I think everything is now kind of sorted, and so the first weekend after the 1st of July, I think it's going to be 5th, 6th of July, something like that, I will obviously do a tasting, an episode of the show on the Series 10 releases that I've chosen, and obviously I will attempt to sell them to you guys, there's some interesting ones that Ian sourced, it has to be said, this time around, so kind of looking forward to that, but you'll obviously have to wait until July until I can officially do that. So yeah, they're the notices, I guess, for this week, let's talk whiskey now, shall we? So I think it's about time that I did an episode of the show on blended whiskey. I mean, as we well know, blends are the bedrock of the whiskey industry. If there were no blended whiskies, there would be no need for distilleries really at the end of the day. I mean, yes, nowadays they can indeed obviously stand on their own 2 feet and just sell a single malt, but pretty much, as we know, the vast majority of distilleries were built and still are purely there to supply malts for the blend. So I'm looking at a number. And to be honest with you, I find the whole history of blended whiskies quite intriguing. I mean, and most of them, and certainly that is the how all of these blends came into being, is they start with a guy running a shop. For example, so I'm looking at Ballantines, Chivas, J&W Hardy and Cato's. Now, Ballantines, for example, was technically founded in 1827 when George Ballantine set up shop in Edinburgh selling groceries, I believe, and wines and spirits. Eventually, I think in 1865, expanded and started to develop his own blend, like a lot of shop owners did, and called it George Ballantine and Sons. And these blends kind of grew in popularity as customers bought them and what have you, and it got to the point where a number of these brand owners decided that they needed to buy the distilleries to essentially keep the source of their malt, and grain to a certain extent. And so certainly in 1935, when Ballantines and Sons was sold to Hiram Walker, I mean, Hiram Walker was the big Canadian entrepreneur who sort of made his money pre and post war, and this was sort of the beginning of his move into Scotch whisky, and so he basically purchased Ballantines and then set about buying distilleries to basically sort of secure the juice. So basically he bought Milton Duff, Glenbergie, and Dumbarton for the grain component. I mean, Dumbarton was closed in 2002, and I think everything has now been shifted to Strathclyde, and obviously the brand again has been sold, and these brands do get sold pretty regularly, it has to be said, and it's now obviously owned by Pernod Ricard, who plonked it in with the Chivas range, which nicely brings me on to Chivas. Now, Chivas was again founded in 1801 by a chap called John Forrest, who set up a grocery store in Aberdeen, which also did whiskey and wine. You see where I'm coming from here? And again, sort of, Chivas has a really intriguing history. Certainly it wasn't until sort of the 1850s when the Chivas family actually got involved in the business and eventually took over the whole of the company. And then it went into the hands of a couple of other guys, Charles Howard and Alexander Smith, who basically then pushed the whole Chivas blend. Basically yeah, like a lot of these blends are sort of waxed and waned throughout the war years, and there was issues, but I mean, basically they carried on sort of trying, or I say First World War, to build up stocks, but eventually had to sell it all, and there's the really interesting stories behind these, and eventually, just after, I think it was 1949, the company was sold to Sam Bronfman, the man of Seagram's, and again, really colourful character. Him and Hiram Walker were having sort of real battles with regards to sort of like, who was going to sort of be the big man of the Scotch whisky industry. And I get the impression that actually Bronfman was very, very much like Trump. Apparently he would sort of lose the plot on quite regular occasions, and some of the battles with other people in the whisky industry were pretty legendary, going beyond just business. They got pretty personal at times, I believe. And so yeah. And then you take, for example, the Antiquary, maybe not quite such a colourful history as Chivas, but again, it's founded in 1861, by James Hardy, who again set up a shop, wine, spirits, groceries in Edinburgh this time as opposed to Aberdeen, and set about eventually moving into the blended whisky, making their own blended whisky in 1880, incidentally the same year that the Gauntlet was established, and eventually it was sold, fell into the hands of Tomatin, as you well know. Tomatin plays a fairly big part in the blend itself, but I believe there's a large amount of other whiskies that go into the blend as well. And of course, like with most blend owners, you haven't got a clue unless you know which distilleries that these companies own. But even then, that doesn't necessarily govern the fact that there's always going to be, that's just going to be all that's in there. They buy in all manner of stock for the brands, but as you well know, they generally have a recipe and they try and stick to that recipe because that's what their customers like. And the final blend we're going to be looking at is one called Cato's. Now, I don't really know very much about Cato's. It's the brand itself is owned by Inverhouse Distillers, but it doesn't actually appear on their UK price list. So I imagine that it's an export only brand, and there are a number of brands that are just purely for one market or the other, either the UK market or the Far East or Europe or whatever. And Cato's was again based in Aberdeen. It was a shop was set up by a chap called James Catto. Don't actually have a note of when that was, but I would guess somewhere in the 1800s. And apparently he was big with P&O apparently, and so Cato's was generally speaking found on the P&O ferries and things like that. So again, this is why I'm assuming that Cato's is probably more popular abroad and probably sold abroad and not actually in the UK. Interestingly enough, now I don't know whether Cato's originally was built around Balblain, Knockdhu, Pulteney, Speyburn and Balmenach. Well, obviously with the exception of Balmenach, all the other distilleries are owned by Inverhouse. So I don't know whether it's a case of Cato's was originally like that or the blend changed when it was purchased by Inverhouse. Blends do. They change over the years. They change with, the sort of what's the prevalent style. Blends back in the sort of like the 1800s, 1870, 1880s were probably a lot heavier on the peat content than they are now, because basically by the sort of mid 1900s, the tastes had changed. People wanted sort of less peat, they wanted lighter, more sort of spey orientated whiskies. So the history and the sort of like the fortunes of these blends are kind of based on the prevailing sort of tastes of the general public. Now, of course, the other thing is with blends is that they still have this association with being cheap, because there are a lot of cheap blends out there, and obviously cheap blends tend to have a lot of cheap ingredients, whether that's kind of young malt or a lot of young grain. They have this perception, but of course, as we know, the Antiquary is 35 years old. Can't remember what that was retailing for, but a fraction, I would imagine, of the price of a 35-year-old single malt. So in essence, they can have incredible value for money. But of course, because they're so big and they're ubiquitous and they're churned out, they're often seen as a kind of as that kind of product, rather than being a single malt which is lovely crafted and all that kind of stuff. But as we well know, you can get some dreadful single malts, and you can get some dreadful blends as well. But you can get, you see what I'm trying to say here. So anyway, I'm getting a little bit dry now. I think I've spoken for long enough. So let's have a look at today's line.
It's giving enough to drive you quietly. There is no sparkling flame.
Okay, so we're going to kick off with the Cato's Rare Old Scottish Blended Whisky. Now, obviously, I like how they use the term sort of rare on blends, when really, when you think about it, it's probably not a very expensive bottling, and the components are not exactly rare, but we'll live with that anyway. So this was sampled from 2015 World Whisky Awards, and I think that will be a nice starter. The second bottling we'll be looking at is for the first of the two Ballantines bottlings. This is called the Hard Fired, bottle of 40%. Now, apparently, hard firing is a technique that Chivas use to rejuvenate casks. Now, nothing new about rejuvenating casks. You know, distilleries and blenders and what have you been at it for years. You know, it's sort of like you want to, you know, more often than not, what, 3, maybe 4 fills at the most you'd get out of a casks, and you know they're expensive to buy. You know, so if you can get away with sort of like reusing them again, then brilliant. And so generally, what has a tendency to happen, they'll split them down, they'll plane off the charred level to expose the new oak, and then they'll rechar it. But in Chivas' case, they don't actually quite do that. They, instead of removing that level of char, they just basically char it all over again. And as you well know, the issues that tend to arise from reusing casks can be that you tend to get an overly aggressive oak character, and you tend to sort of get more of the bitter tannins and less of the sort of the sweeter lactones and vanillins and things like that. And sometimes that oak can also taste slightly false as well, like it's been forced. Not always, and of course obviously we will you know, approach this with an open mind. The second of the 2 Ballantine's bottlings we'll be looking at is the Ballantine's 21-year-old Signature Oak Edition, European Oak, bottled at 40.1%. This was a travel retail bottling released, I believe, in 2015, which has been matured in European Oak. European Oak sherry casks, I believe, and yeah, we shall see what that is like. The first of the 2 Chivas bottlings we'll be looking at is the Chivas Regal Extra Blended Scotch Whisky, bottled at 40%. Again, this was introduced in 2015 as a sort of, I think, as an entry level bottling. I guess I don't have any direct dealings with the sort of like the big blends, so you know, a lot of the time I haven't got a clue, to be honest with you. So as far as I'm aware, this the blend of that went into the extra had more first fill Oloroso matured spirit. So as you can see, has quite a dark colour. So yes, we shall see what that is like. Then we shall move on to the second of the Chivas bottlings. This is the Chivas Regal 18-year-old Ultimate Cask Collection First Fill American Oak Finish, bottled at 48%. Again, another travel retail bottling that was introduced in 2015, so could be interesting. And finally, the Antiquary. This is the Antiquary 35-year-old, bottled at 46%. This was a limited edition that was released in late 2015. It was a limited edition of 800 odd bottles, and like I said, can't remember what it was retailing for, but I imagine considerably less than, say, a 35-year-old bottle of Tomatin. But anyway, that's today's lineup. Let's start with a bit of Cato then. Okay, so let's see what the notes give us. It's young, it's pleasant, it's fresh, it's slightly floral, there's barley, there's a little bit of dried fruit, a little bit of spice. I mean, it's you can see the DNA of kind of Knockdo and Balblair quite obviously in this. There's a little bit of honeyed note. There's a little bit of a graininess to it. You know, it's got that little bit of an edge on the nose. It feels like it's got a good degree of malt. It certainly doesn't come across as overtly grainy. So it's a little bit. The grain does feel quite young. It's got that slight sort of botanical edge to it, which is starting to kind of come through. But I think there's you know, it's a blend that's quite pleasant. Let's see what the fire's like. the palate is a little bit flat, and I don't think that's natural caramel. There's a little bitterness, and it doesn't quite have the liveliness, it doesn't quite have the sort of freshness of the nose, and I don't know why that's been done. I can't figure that one out, because that has a lovely nose. It was, you know, nice and highlandy and fresh and crisp, and then you go and do that, and it didn't really need to have that sort of caramel flattening. I could well be wrong. It could well be just oak, but you know, I would have thought that I would have got a little bit more. If that was oak vanillins, I would expected at least a little bit more intimation of that on the nose, when there really isn't anything at all. So what I'm guessing is that they've used casks that have been, you know, fairly well used, not really added a great deal of oak character, and then we'll just slip a bit of caramel in just to sort of kind of make it appear that it's got some oak character. It's done all the time. Blends do it, you know. It shouldn't be done. It's naughty, but it happens. There you go. Right, okay, so let's look at the first of the two Ballantines bottlings. This is the hard fired. See what those goes. There's not a lot going on the nose initially, which is quite surprising. I mean, you know, you look at the colour of that and you would have thought, whoa, that's going to be a real smack in the face of oak, and it isn't really. I get a lot of grain. It's got some nice sweet grain, it's got some nice spicy grain. There's some honey, there's some fruit, there's a little bit of esteriness, there's surprisingly not very much in the way of bitter oak. There's a little bit of oak vanilla, and like I said, I'm just really quite surprised at how less of an impact the oak is having on this nose. I wonder whether all of the casks used in this blend were hard fired. I'm suspecting that, shall we say, this was a vatting of some of those casks and some, you know, pretty much normal casks, because, you know, I would expect if all of these casks had been rejuvenated, you would have got a lot more aggressive oak character, and I think that the master blender, what's his name, Sandy Hislop, has probably basically done, well, yeah, okay, I want a bit of that kind of character, but I don't want to go OTT, and you can argue that he's achieved that. So, but the nose is just nothing really special about it, to be honest with you. Anyway, let's see what the palate's like. Again, it's pretty simple, it's straightforward. There's a little bit of sherry, or what appears to be sherry sweetness. There's some creamy oak, there's some soft fruit. Again, feels like there's a fair amount of malt, not a lot of grain character. Grain does come through on the finish. And again, it's not bad, but it's not sort of like, you know, it's just sort of, yeah, it's okay. And you would have thought from something, if you're going to sort of like give it all a waffle about hard firing and recharring and all this, you would at least kind of, you know, have a little bit more of that kind of character, and at least make it memorable. I mean, even if it is bitter as hell, you could certainly say, well, it's certainly memorable. But yeah, so alright, okay, it's probably a bit more drinkable, but it's fairly bland, really, at the end of the day.
But then be shy and then get fainted, yours it shows why you
Okay, so let's move on to the 21-year-old. Let's see what the nose gives us on this. Now, of course, travel retail bottlings don't tend to have the sort of the best press, shall we say, for obvious reasons that we well know about. But anyway, let's see what this one gives us. Now that is a lovely nose. Evocative, floral, sweet barley, honey. It's certainly got that sort of slightly heathery kind of note to it. It's got a little bit of judicious sherry notes. There's a little bit of herbal oloroso. But there's some lovely fruit as well. It's got some citrus, it's got some green gage, it's got some apricot, a bit of apple. It's got some nice maturity to it as well. It's a lovely nose. It really is quite impressive. It's beautifully balanced. It's, you know, how, again, I like my use of sherry casks. I don't want it to be completely swamping everything, and it isn't. It is just adding that sort of, you know, slight sort of spiciness, that slight sort of treacly, not quite treacle, sort of dark toffee possibly. Anyway, so we'll pass on. Really quite creamy, soft. I can see the sort of DNA of the Ballantines with the yeah, having tasted the first bottling. There's a lot more complex, a lot more going on. There's, again, judicious, spicy, sherried, dried fruit, a little bit of oak. Again, feels like there's quite a lot of malt in that blend, and if there isn't, it's certainly sort of punching above its weight. The grain just really only kind of comes through on the finish with that sort of little bit of grainy, grippy spiciness. Got some lovely maturity. He feels a little younger than 21. I wouldn't have said it was that old, you know, tasting it blind, but it's an impressive blend nevertheless, and seeing the fact that it's a travel retail bottling as well, you know, you've got to say, well, they haven't just used old crap to you know, stick in that bottle. That was actually a lovely whiskey. Right, okay, so let's move on to the first of the two Chivas bottlings. This is the Chivas Regal Extra. Let's see whether those good as on this end, shall we? Pretty dense, syrup, dried fruit. It's quite reserved. It's dense, but it's unyielding. It's not really, it's chunky, it's tight. It's not really giving an awful lot away, to be honest with you. There's a little bit of a herbal note. There's a little bit of a, almost kind of herbally rye kind of note. I mean, for something that's got a lot of sherry casks in it, it is sherried, obviously, but it's not kind of like a roaring sherried monster, if you see what I mean. It's quite, not really subtle, reticent is the word I would use. Yeah, silver pass on. Oh, that's got a short bit of finish. God, bloody hell. Yeah, alright, it's got some creaminess. You can argue that the balance is okay. It's a bit bland, it's a bit boring, it has to be said. There's no real highs and lows. There's malt, there's fruit, there's sherry, there's a bit of chocolatiness, a bit of sort of almost sort of herbal rye, you know. I mean, alright, there's an element of complexity, but we're not getting sort of, you know, too, we're not getting the bunting out for this one yet, as they say. It's just, again, it's kind of like, you know, it's okay, nothing wrong with it. There's no dirtiness, there's no off notes, but it's just sort of like, well, no, it's alright, you know. It's maybe a little overly oaky. Certainly the oak is kind of bittering out on the finish. And it's a bit reticent on the nose, and it's a bit kind of dull, really, I suppose. If you know, you're going to be really brutally honest about that, it's, yeah, it is what it is, I suppose, at the end of the day. Right, okay, so on to the Ultimate Cask Collection First Fill American Oak Finish. See what the nose gives us. It's quite a mouthful, isn't it? That is a nice nose. It's got some lovely maturity. It actually feels probably a little older than the 18. There's a little bit of almost kind of sawdustiness. Yes, there's some fresh oak, but again, it's balanced. There's some lovely sort of dried fruit, mature dried fruit, sort of sub Armagnac-y. It's got that sort of, you know, it's got a lovely maturity. It's got, you know, it smells old, but the sort of first fill American oak is not sort of OTT. You know, it's kind of maybe adding a little bit enlivening note, but yeah, I like this. I think this is quite impressive. I mean, it's certainly better than the sort of, you know, bog standard. It's got a bit more going on. It's also 48% as well, so that extra amount of alcohol, you know, just kind of gives it a little bit more of a punch to it. I mean, the thing is, as we well know, with blended whiskies, they're all about the price point, and hence why the majority of them are bottled at 40%, because, you know, it's all price sensitive, and obviously one of the biggest, or should we say one of the controllable components, should we say, of any whiskey is obviously the amount of duty, because it's a set point, if you see what I mean. So basically, by bottling at 40%, you know you're paying less duty than you're bottling it at 48%, for example. Anyway, let's see what that's like. There's a lot of oak, but it's classy oak, it has to be said. Fruitcakey, but not sherry fruitcake. Dried fruit, a little short on the finish. There's some nice kind of spicy notes. There's a little bit of cinnamon, possibly a bit of cardamom, a little bit of bitter tannin, but not too much. Again, a little bit of creaminess. Now, I think that's all in all told, that's actually really pleasant. The malt is talking, and you know, even though it's first fill American oak, it's not overly first fill American oak. I mean, it's finished in first fill, so I imagine it's probably been aged in refill casks, and yes, you could argue that the first fill American oak is adding a bit more oak character than it probably had to begin with. And this is the thing with blends, it's all about sort of like, you know, getting your components and bringing them together at the end of the day. So you can't really sort of complain too much about, you know, doing things like this. And certainly when the end product is pleasant, you know.
So clear, don't mess up your mind with fear.
Right, okay, and on to the final whiskey of the day. This is the Antiquary 35-year-old. Let's see what the nose gives on this end, shall we? Oh, you smell the maturity. Mature fruitcake, dusty spices, cinnamon, almond, walnut, treacle, plummy. Oh, God, this is gorgeous. I mean, yes, there's a lot of sherry in here, and yes, there's not a great deal of spirit character, but, you know, as we well know, give the sherry 30 odd years, and it becomes bloody gorgeous. It's just aromatic, it's dense, it's succulent, it's got a slight floral note, there's a little bit of earth, there's just a smidgen of peat just there. I mean, this is just, and I'll tell you what, I mean, I love the Antiquary range from beginning to end. I mean, yes, alright, the bog standard no age statement is quite grainy, and it's 20 quid, you know, it's like, well, what do you expect? It's still bloody good quality. I mean, obviously you get the 12 and the 18, or was it the 21, I forget. Yeah, 12 and 21, which are, you know, the quality level is going up, and then you get to this and you just go, oh. Anyway, sort of pass on. Not sweet on the palate. The ABV is kind of just offsetting some of that sherry sweetness. Still wonderfully mature, moist, armagnac-y, dried fruits, plum, raisin, touch of vanilla, a little bit of violets, a little bit of peat, some earth. God almighty, that is bloody gorgeous, it has to be said. I mean, that is mouth-filling, long, unctuous, juicy, stunning, absolutely stunning. Yeah, right. Okay, we can argue that there's very little spirit character there. Here's a bit. There's some, you know, mature barley, it has to be said, but it is more sort of oak orientated, and not a surprise given it the fact that it's 35 years old. But the balance is stunning. The maturity is stunning, and it is just Right, okay, so let's very, very quickly sum up today's episode of the show, as I seem to be sort of running it over time. The Catos, yeah, okay, perfectly pleasant blend. Lovely nose, very typical of the distilleries that it's sourced from. Big shame about the palate. The Ballantine's hard fired, yeah, okay, I can see what they were getting at with that kind of blend, and you could argue it's worked, you know, it's not. It gives you an inkling of the whole concept of you know, rejuvenating casks, but it's kind of lost something. It's kind of been neutered, I suppose. The Ballantine's 21, yeah, okay, perfectly good. Really, very, very good. Can't argue with that whatsoever. The Chivas Regal Extra, again, perfectly pleasant blend. You wouldn't be disappointed if you were handed that. It's no highs, no lows. It's whiskey at the end of the day, shall we say. The Chivas 18, slightly more impressive, it has to be said. Loved the American oak. Again, I suppose you could argue maybe not the most complex of bottlings on the face of the planet, but certainly yeah, nice. And the Antiquary 35-year-old, I mean, well, obviously that, well, it wasn't always going to be the best bottling of the day, but I mean, it was pretty much odds on, it has to be said. I mean, and like I said, you know, the Antiquary is a range that I love to stock because it is really, really good from start to finish. And it's not because I love Tomatin, it is a very, very good blended whiskey. And yeah, so there you have it. Really intriguing episode of the show, I think. Always love to do sort of an episode on blends because, you know, I think they are very, very overlooked. And you can argue that none of them were really bad. There was no real bad blends. I mean, the Catto was a bit disappointing, and maybe the Chivas Regal was a bit disappointing. But, you know, certainly if you got given a bottle of those, you would not say, I'm going to clean the toilet with that. So yeah, there you go. That's this week's episode of the show in the bag. All that's left to say is good afternoon, good ramming.